lecturer for Interregnum 9 is Dr. John Fleming. He graduated from the University of the South in 1958. He then went for 3 years as a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford, where he took a honors BA in English. He spent 2 years at Princeton getting a PhD before becoming an instructor in English at the University of Wisconsin. He has taught at Princeton since 1965. He is the former chair of the English department at Princeton, the former master of Wilson College, and the current faculty director of the program and freshman seminars. Jointly appointed in the Department of Comparative Literature, Dr. Fleming has published extensively in the fields of medieval English and European literature, medieval art, history, and a history of Christian thought and spirituality. Dr. Fleming also wrote a well-received book about the Cold War titled The Anti-Communist Manifestos, 4 books that shaped the Cold War. And in this well-respected work, Dr. Fleming discusses critiques of communism provided by 4 anti-communist authors, including Arthur Koestler and Whittaker Chambers. Dr. Fleming also has an exciting new book coming out in July titled The Dark Side of the Enlightenment. This book is about the spread of the occult and interest in magic, Kabbalah, and alchemy during the so-called Age of Reason. In addition to his writing accomplishments, Dr. Fleming is a winner of the Berman Award for Distinguished Achievement in the Humanities and the Princeton President's Medal for Distinguished Teaching. Last spring, he received the Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Award. He serves on numerous editorial boards and national committees, and he is a past president of the Medieval Academy of America. Dr. John Fleming, though a medievalist, probably outblogs everyone in this room. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. John Fleming.
Thank you very much. I've got to tell you that that introduction, though very kind, I think was taken from the Princeton website. I retired from Princeton 6 years ago. I'm no longer the director of anything there. But aside from that, all those things are true. Now, I'm naturally keenly aware of the honor that comes with the invitation to deliver one of your Interregnum lectures, even if its flattery is somewhat muted by the specificity of the assignment. For I have been asked, or to call it for what it is, instructed, to lecture to you on duty. Yes, duty. And I'm left to wonder whether in a long career of lecturing, I've ever before been saddled with such a dog of a title. I have, of course, listened to a few that were similarly unprepossessing. I used to attend, purely out of duty, of course, the annual meeting of the Modern Language Association. I once sat through a paper on wit and humor in the Anglo-Saxon elegy. That came close, but it was probably bested by Browning's use of the comma. So I will do my duty, which is, after all, easier than yours. I merely have to lecture. You have to listen. Or fake it. To lecture to you on duty strikes me not merely as difficult, but also slightly peculiar. My understanding is that yours is an educational institution explicit in its allegiance to a Christian vision. Duty is not a Christian virtue, except perhaps by adoption. To put it another way, duty is a distinctly secular and pagan virtue. The great expert on duty, as we shall soon enough have to see, is the Roman philosopher Cicero. Now, this claim will perhaps seem unconvincing to those of you familiar with a book called The Whole Duty of Man, dating from 1658, and one of the classics of Protestant culture for the following 2 centuries, or at least with the biblical text, which is Ecclesiastes 12:13, from which that title is taken. Quote, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of man." But what the Septuagint said was not that the fear of God was the duty of man, but rather that it was the whole man. Still, duty did certainly become Christian by adoption, and the adoption process will be one of the subjects of this talk. Duty, said one famous American, is the sublimest word in the English language. I wonder whether you know who he was. Duty is the sublimest word in the English language. The answer is Robert E. Lee. One can hardly doubt that Lee practiced what he preached. Certainly he lived a most dutiful life. It was not surprising, perhaps, that military history provides so many episodes of the heroic performance of duty, since the concept of duty is so articulate and so apparently clear-cut in the system of military command. It might be useful to remind ourselves of a few episodes in Lee's career. He was already past 50 when, in 1858, he first came onto the national stage as the Marine officer charged with responding to the raid on the armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, led by the radical abolitionist John Brown. It had been Brown's intention to start a rebellion among black slaves armed with the weapons taken from the armory. There were about 20 people killed in this action, mostly among the abolitionists. Brown himself was wounded, captured, and later hanged, as were several of his collaborators. A few years later, and more famously in the Civil War, Lee became commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, and indeed the chief general officer of the armies of the Confederacy. Though he had sworn an oath to defend the United States and its Constitution, he considered his duty to the Commonwealth of Virginia of higher priority. There were more than 500,000 dead in the American Civil War, quite apart from other vast suffering and destruction. Now, Robert E. Lee was a great man. He was a serious Christian man, a member of my own church, as a matter of fact. He lived a life of service and of duty. Upon his tomb was written the famous line from Lucan's Pharsalia, "Victrix causa Deis placuit, sed victa Catoni." The cause of the victors was pleasing to the gods, but the cause of the vanquished to Cato. You might remember Cato because, as it turns out, he has an awful lot to do with the classical Christian concept of duty. But what we must ask was the, quote, cause of the vanquished. Many factors were at play in the American Civil War, but its root cause was the same as the root cause of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry: the legal institution of chattel slavery, the great contradiction and original sin in which our republic had been conceived. One of the marching songs of the Union troops was John Brown's Body. John Brown's body lies a moldering in his grave, but his soul is marching on. He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so few, and frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, they themselves the traitor's crew, but his soul is marching on. It is the historian's first task to study and to understand the past. Judging it, though perhaps a necessary task and certainly a delicate one, is secondary. Few things are more intellectually slovenly than simply to slather the conventional values of the moment atop the circumstances of the past, like maple syrup over a stack of pancakes, to watch them drip deliciously down the sides. On the other hand, the absolute moral indifference of the cultural anthropologist, imagining for a moment that such a thing were achievable, is hardly less problematic. We may honor General Lee's fidelity to duty while also questioning the tribal code in which his sense of duty was embedded. The fact is, of course, that duty always becomes complicated by context. The Nazi leaders in attendance at the Wannsee Conference in 1942, at which Heydrich laid out the party's strategy to date for the solution to the Jewish problem, were animated by a keen sense of duty, a duty that many of them regarded as unpleasant, indeed repugnant, but before which not a single one of them would flinch. The judges at Nuremberg, however, were not inclined to acquit them when they pleaded, truthfully, so far as I can judge, that all that they had done out of duty. Now, I understand that you've been reading Sophocles' Antigone, among other relevant texts. It's a wonderful play and plays wonderfully to our theme of duty, precisely because its concept of duty is, if I may say so, rather simple and monochrome, and therefore inescapable. There is a duty to bury dead bodies. What goes without saying very often goes unsaid, and the grounds from which this duty springs are never quite absolutely explicit. But in ascending order, the obligations seem to be: 1, common decency; next, familial piety; next, civil decorum; next, the divine order of things. Now, Antigone's difficulties in being dutiful are bred of no exquisite moral complication, but of the barbarous and capricious brutality of the tyrant Creon. Her courageous perseverance in decency is, of course, morally beautiful, since perseverance in the performance of duty, when the cost is so great to the performer, can hardly fail to be impressive. But there is little interrogation in this play, as there is elsewhere in Greek drama, and indeed elsewhere in Sophocles himself, of the divine order of things. The obligation of sepulture is a part of the way things are. If you want to know what is right about Sophocles, you can read Aristotle's Poetics. If you want to know some of the other ways things are, you can read Aristotle's Politics, with his assumptions of the rightness of slavery and the rightness of female subordination, and above all, the rightness of Athenian empire. Very right, says Aristotle, very right is that line in Hesiod. It is meet that Greeks should rule over barbarians. Now, those same texts are the ones that Jefferson and Madison had been weaned on, of course, not to mention Robert E. Lee himself. Antigone knows what her duty is in the opening speech of the play, and she has explicitly articulated the conflict it entails within the play's first 50 lines. Just as clear is the point of view of her sister Ismene, who understands the duty no less sharply, but who allows it to be trumped, sensibly enough, from the practical point of view, by the force majeure of Creon's dictate. But the concept of duty in literature may become more poignant still when the dutiful have a partial or an imperfect understanding of what their duty is. The great epic of the Latin tradition is Virgil's Aeneid. It is, as you know, the epic of the foundation of Rome. Like all of ancient Latin literature, it grows directly from Greek models. The models here, of course, being the two great epic poems of Homer. Thus, in its very form, it proclaimed the doctrine of what was called the translatio studii. Now, this untranslatable phrase means something like the migration of culture. It was the conservative and preservative belief that culture was a precious tradition, fixed, eternal, and immutable in its substance, but fugitive, temporal, and protean in its manifestations. To understand the concept, you must put yourself in the position of a Roman patrician of the Augustan age. Your traditions all descended from ancient Troy. Indeed, you poetically called your imperial city, Rome, by the name of New Troy. But you knew, too, that before Troy, and as ancient and as far anterior to Troy as Troy had been to Rome, there had been Thebes. The history of Thebes was born in the tragedy of Oedipus, a tragedy concerning the fearful limitations of self-knowledge. It had continued in the fatal error of the regnancy divided between Eteocles and Polynices, the material of Antigone and other Theban plays in Greek, and of the epic of Statius in Latin. You will recognize it as well as the central folly of King Lear, who comes at last to realize that his dereliction of duty is that of a foolish, fond old man. A direct line linked the practically prehistoric Thebes to the fictively historical Troy, the subject of Homer's great Iliad. Virgil's Aeneid would be the link between Troy and Rome. It is the story of how the young Trojan prince Aeneas made his way with a small band of survivors from the burning city of their birth to found a new city in Latium in Italy. Aeneas bears a heavy duty, the duty to found the greatest empire the world has yet known. His fulfillment of his duty is the subject of the epic, but the hero achieves it only after overcoming many obstacles and difficulties. One of the first and worst of these is internal. Aeneas has not fully grasped his task. Early in the poem, he is shipwrecked upon the Carthaginian shore in North Africa. He's invited into Queen Dido's palace, and not long after that, into her bed. Under these circumstances, he seems to forget his duty entirely. In fact, he does forget it entirely. The god Mercury, stern and unsmiling, must come to him in his sleep with the order, navigat, sail on. So he does sail on, leaving Dido to despair and suicide. Now, romantic and post-romantic generations of readers have difficulty grasping what every reader of Virgil down to the 18th century instinctively understood, which is that Aeneas's desertion of Dido is a moment of moral triumph for the epic hero. Aeneas has remained true to his duty. As for us, we revel in the conflict of love and duty, provided that love wins. Remember the great song from the great old movie, High Noon. Oh, to be torn twixt love and duty, supposing I lose my fair-haired beauty. It's quite otherwise in the classical tradition. Hanky-panky in a cave is all well and good for juveniles, but real men found empires. Political empires or moral empires. In his Confessions, Augustine remakes this Virgilian scene as the emblematically appropriate model for his own departure from Carthage to Milan, rather unfairly casting his mother in the role of the African queen. Augustine will no longer haunt the bed of his abandoned mistress. In Milan, he will sit at the feet of his great teacher, St. Ambrose, of whom we must hear more presently. In other words, in the Aeneid, the hero grows incrementally into a greater understanding of duty. In medieval literature, characters who fail to learn lose their heroic aura. Few moments in that literature are more shocking than that in Chrétien's great Knight of the Charette, or the Lancelot, in which Lancelot, motivated by an adulterous love, leaps up into the cart used for transporting criminals. To get Troilus into Cressida's bedroom, Pandarus tells her a real whopper. He says that the unstoppable lover has climbed into the house, unbeknownst to him, through a privy gutter. Now, this is a moment that, if I may say so, reeks of low comedy. How my colleagues can read it without laughing out loud is hard to say. But so solemn has the sexual sacrament become in modernity that there is no room for laughter. In the 18th century, Alexander Pope spelled out in his poetic essay on criticism the identity of the poetic process of Virgil's remaking of Homer with the historical and political process of Rome's remaking of Troy. Now, to understand these lines, you need only to know that Mero is one of the names for Virgil, and that the Stagirite is Aristotle, who was a native of a place called Stagira in Macedon. When first young Mero in his boundless mind the worked out last immortal Rome design, perhaps he seemed above the critic's law, and but from nature's fountain scorned to draw. But when to examine every part he came, nature and Homer were, he found, the same. Convinced, amazed, he checks the bold design, and rules as strict as labor's works confine, as if the Stagirite o'erlooked each line. Learn here, for ancient rules, a just esteem. To copy nature is to copy them. Now, incidentally, I hope that I need not apologize to this group for quoting so many old books. Do not attribute the phenomenon to the fact that I am a medievalist and an aficionado of long-dead authors. It is a simple reality that duty is a very old concept, and that the most interesting things said about duty were said quite a while ago. Having spent most of my life among colleagues who seem to think that serious culture began probably around 1913, I'm somewhat sensitive about these matters. I do read current books whenever possible, but the philosophical principle of parsimony somewhat constricts me. I was for some years the chairman of our English department, and one of the duties of that office was to socialize on occasion with New York intellectuals and glamorous women in publishing. I was once at one such event when a glamorous woman in publishing engaged me in a conversation that soon turned to the novelist John Updike. Had I read his latest book? Now, I'm an admirer of Updike. I've read many of his novels, but I had not read the very latest. It was entitled The Coup, which means that the events described must have taken place in 1979. I had to confess to my interlocutor that I had not read The Coup. Such faint and tentative interest as I might have inspired in the glamorous woman in publishing drained from her face. What a pity, she said, as she turned toward greener intellectual pastures. It's been out for 6 weeks. But there are times when humiliation brings inspiration, and I did not simply let her walk away. Have you, I asked loudly, have you read The Consolation of Philosophy? This gave her pause. The consolation of what, she said? Philosophy. The Consolation of Philosophy. Incredible though it may strike you, she had not read it. Now I too pivoted away in a new direction, but not without a Parthian shot. What a pity, I said. It's been out for 1,400 But of course, modern literature has by no means abandoned the theme of duty, which it not infrequently is approached from an oblique angle or an ironic perspective. What exactly is duty? And how is it to be adjudicated within a complex social world? Here, it seems to me, the indispensable writer is Joseph Conrad, and the indispensable book, Lord Jim. I like to plug Conrad when I can. He's a great writer, one of our very greatest indeed, and certainly one with an uncommon clarity of ethical focus. He's no longer widely read in our colleges, as his supposed thought crimes concerning various topics dear to the cultural enforcers of the moment are conspicuous. Lord Jim is a story about duty, its dereliction, and the consequences of both. Like many of Conrad's sea stories, it's set around the turn of the 20th century, somewhere vaguely in the Malay archipelago. Jim, we never get a surname, is a British sailor, the first mate of a ship called the Patna, which is carrying a large number of Muslim pilgrims toward Arabia for the Hajj pilgrimage. Catastrophe ensues when the Patna crashes into a submerged hulk, which rips it open. It seems certain that the ship will sink, and quickly, the captain and other crew members, abandoning their passengers, leap to safety in a small open boat and encourage Jim to follow them. Now, nothing could be clearer in terms of maritime duty than the obligation to stay with his human cargo. But Jim, too, jumps to safety. The two vessels are soon separated. The English crew is sure that the Patna has sunk. One man insists he saw it sink. But the Patna, though dangerously swamped, does not sink. A French vessel comes upon it, adrift and still threatening to sink at any moment. With great courage and skill, a French officer attaches a line to the stricken ship. The Frenchmen are able to tow it to port. The crew of the Patna is also rescued and brought to land. Naturally, there is a maritime inquiry. For complicated reasons, likely to leave us feeling some sympathy for Jim, he alone is being tried for dereliction of duty. After all, his superior officer had already sought safety and had encouraged him to do the same. After all, he was sincerely convinced that the Patna had sunk. But there is no doubt that in that moment of crisis, in that instant when he was faced with the necessity of a split-second decision, Jim had abandoned his ship. He had jumped. Jim is judged guilty, and his mariner's papers are withdrawn. Now, this incident has already happened when Lord Jim begins. It is the premise rather than the subject of the novel. The questions of the nature of Jim's dereliction of duty and the extent of its ramifications are subtly pursued through a longish book. As you may know, in his sea tales, Conrad sometimes employs a tricky intermediary narrator, Marlowe, adding further layers of possible ambiguity on what is already a slightly slippery narrative surface. Most of the book is about Jim's quest for moral redemption. I'm almost tempted to say his salvation, for Conrad is among those secular authors who seem ever to be dealing with crypto-theological themes. So what is duty? There is, of course, one classic book on this subject. It is the De Officiis of Cicero. Notice the plural. Latin officium, office, meant duty, function, or even job in a specific sense. It was so used widely in the Vulgate, that is the Latin translation of the Bible in the Middle Ages, as for example, by St. Paul in 2 Corinthians 9:12, quote, "For the administration of this service, ministerium huius officii, not only supplies the want of the saints, but overflows also in much gratitude to the Lord." We still use the word in a Ciceronian sense when we speak of a political office. So Cicero's title might best be translated as concerning duties, with the singular abstraction duty being thought of as the distillation of them all. The De Officiis was the last major work undertaken by Cicero, and at least since the neoclassical revival of the 18th century, it has often been regarded as his greatest work. Like so many of his works, it leans heavily on anterior Greek sources, in this instance upon the Perikathikontos of the Stoic philosopher Panetius of Rhodes. He does criticize Panetius for never defining duty. He makes good this want with a binary distinction. Quote, "Every treatise on duty has two parts. One, dealing with the doctrine of the supreme good, the other with the practical rules by which daily life in all its bearings may be regulated." It is in the union of the two parts that Cicero made his lasting contribution. He introduced the concept of moral duty. One aspect of duty is expediency, making the trains run on time. But, says Cicero the Stoic, expediency itself is ever subject to moral review. to see whether the making the trains run on time is consistent with the supreme good. The larger social good must always trump private gratification. Thus, men have a duty to self-discipline. Occasionally, the public good and private gratification coalesce in surprising ways. Cato, having been so publicly censorious of the tyranny of Caesar, was acting dutifully, according to Cicero, when he committed suicide at the end of the Civil War. That may strike you as odd, but the hyper-Christian Dante seems to agree. Although he, Dante, had a special place in hell for suicides, he made Cato of Utica the gatekeeper of purgatory. That's an extraordinary thing. As a philosopher, Cicero exemplifies the spirit of the translatio studii almost too perfectly. He had made it his life's work to make available in prestigious Latin forms the entire body of philosophy that Plato had compiled in Greek, just as later, in the Christian period, his disciple Boethius would undertake the same officium with regard to the Greek philosophical corpus of Aristotle. Cicero had not done so through what we today would call translation. For him, the technical term of art would more likely have been imitatio, imitation. For us, imitation is a bad word, but it was not so with our ancestors in the classical tradition. Now, if you doubt me, I would refer you to St. Anselm's prologue to his monologium, or soliloquy. Anselm is one of the most brilliant theologians of the 12th century, which is saying a lot. As a philosopher, he's the inventor of the so-called ontological argument for the existence of God. His three most profound theological tractates, the Monologium, the Proslogion, and the Cur Deus Homo, Why Did God Become Man, are among the most brilliantly original creations of a vibrant period of classical Renaissance. That is according to Fleming. You hear a different story from Anselm himself. What he says in the prologue to the Monologium, in my paraphrase, is roughly this. Quote, "Charitable reader, please do not think there is anything original in this work. I have taken all the ideas from the Catholic Fathers, and especially from St. Augustine, and especially from that book of St. Augustine called De Trinitate. It takes a near genius to understand the De Trinitate of Augustine, and an actual genius to grasp the connection between the De Trinitate and Anselm's Monologium. But Anselm was determined to avoid the charge of originality. The artistic ideal of classicism is beautifully expressed again in another couplet of Pope's. True wit is nature to advantage dressed. What oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. What oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. Such was the spirit in which Cicero approached Plato. Cicero knew he was a great writer of Latin prose, the greatest writer of Latin prose, indeed. The only thing that could absolve so outrageous a conceit was that the conceit was true. Plato might oft be thought, but he would be read by the Roman world in a Ciceronian form ne'er so well expressed, not even by Plato himself. You may recall that Augustine tells us in his Confessions that he was practically converted to the religious life by reading the Hortensius of Cicero, a portion of his lost Republica. Remember, too, what Augustine tells us in the De Vera Religione, quote, Practically all of the Platonists of our age, he writes, have embraced Christianity at the small expense of making some slight change in their vocabularies. What made Ciceronian Platonic philosophy so congenial to the Christianity of the Augustinian milieu, Christianity with a radical ascetic tilt, was its large Stoic content. If medieval poets had tried to make Virgil a Christian before his time, medieval thinkers of many stripes tried to do the same for Cicero. What might be called Cicero's pseudo-Christian reputation followed him throughout the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. Quote, "You might sometimes think," says Petrarch, "that it is not a pagan philosopher, but a Christian apostle who speaks." The phenomenon of which I speak is encapsulated in a well-known phrase attributed to everybody from Pythagoras of Samos to Sir Isaac Newton, but which is most relevant for me among the Victorines of the 12th century Renaissance. "We are," says Thierry of Chartres, speaking of himself and other contemporary thinkers, "we are dwarves astride the shoulders of giants." Whoever had, in fact, said it, had said something brilliant and something worthy of repetition through the ages. If it is an apothegm that is at once self-effacing and boldly assertive, the modern dwarf admits that any attempt to go up against the ancient giant, mano a mano, so to speak, would be absurdly futile. But from the vantage point of the giant's shoulders, that is to say, by adding the increment of his own achievement, however slight, to the giant's achievement, the dwarf may justly claim to see a more distant horizon. The spirit of the idea is exemplified in many great masterpieces of medieval and Renaissance art, but by none more brilliantly than by Dante in his Divine Comedy. Dante Alighieri was a Virgilian through and through. He'd virtually digested the Aeneid and made it a part of his artistic physiognomy. The very conception of the Commedia is related to Virgil's epic, and there are literally hundreds of textual echoes and imitations of it in Dante's poem. Quite beyond that, Dante actually brought the historical character Virgil into his poem. He was the indispensable guide and tutor of the narrator Dante, a narrator who first appears on the scene, adrift and fearful, lost in a dark wood that is the topographic analog of his spiritual state. Nonetheless, Virgil must play a tragic role in a comic poem, for Virgil can never see the face of God. He's doomed to hell for eternity. It's the high rent district of hell, to be sure, but still far from the beatific vision. Only Beatrice, blessedness indeed, can guide Dante to that terminal bliss. In other words, what Dante is telling us is that he is a better poet than Virgil is, not because he is a superior writer in a technical sense, but because he enjoys the providential advantage of the Christian revelation. Like Virgil, perhaps, Cicero was almost a Christian. The giant's head was almost as high as the head of the dwarf upon his back. Unfortunately, in biblical theology, almost doesn't win the prize. Close doesn't count, save in horseshoes and hand grenades. Thus, early Christian writers could, without inconsistency, be censorious of pagan writers they very much admired. Augustine, who so greatly admired what he found in the pages of Cicero and the Platonists, was no less acutely aware of what he did not find there. He writes thus in the 7th book of the Confessions, quote, "There," speaking of the books of the Platonists, "there also did I read that God, the Word, was not born of flesh, nor of blood, nor of the will of man, nor of the will of the flesh, but of God. But that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, that I did not read there." The Christians thought that Cicero had come close on duty, just not close enough. Every teacher has had the experience of a brilliant student, delightful but slightly wacky, who is, well, almost. You feel that all would be well if you could just get inside this person's head with a finely crafted Phillips head screwdriver and make a minute clockwise adjustment. If only. Now that is the way that St. Ambrose, Augustine's great teacher, felt about Cicero, author of the De Officiis. And that is why Ambrose, around the year 390, decided to rescue Cicero by rewriting his book. There's not time to discuss at length the De Officiis of Ambrose, usually called the De Officiis Ministrorum, concerning the duties of church ministers, except to say that from a biblical point of view, it is bigger and better in every way than its Ciceronian model. It thus exemplifies, in a particularly vivid form, the genius of Christian humanism, a genius both conservative and recuperative on the one hand, and revolutionary and inventive on the other. The term humanist is threatened by misappropriation to today's celebrity atheists, but it still rightly belongs to the likes of Petrarch, Erasmus, and Rabelais, Spencer, and Milton. These men were interested in the following question: what difference, if any, does it make for the cultural heritage of mankind that God became man, that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us? Well, how could not so stupendous an intervention in the human situation change things? Ambrose thought it must have changed everything, not excluding our understanding of duty. The Stoic view of duty was already social in its utter rejection of hedonism, which is always inward and individual, but now duty was to become radically social in a specifically Christian and biblical sense. From one point of view, Jesus had reduced the 10 Commandments by 80%. He said they could all be boiled down to 2 precepts: love of God, love of neighbor. On the night before his crucifixion, in circumstances of the highest possible drama, Jesus had given his followers what he calls a new commandment. A new commandment I give you: love one another. As I have loved you, so must you love one another. Now, this concept of love, which in the Latin philosophical vocabulary came to be called caritas, had no analog in the language of Stoicism. It was absent from the lexicon because it was absent from the society. This is why the gospel was able to conquer in a couple of centuries a vast world that Socrates and Cicero had scarcely touched. Ambrose saved duty for the Christians by equating it with the law of love. He did this somewhat obliquely. If I had been given a gazelle of a topic, like love, instead of this dog of a topic, duty, I could have told you about the great 12th century Cistercian Aelred of Rievaulx. He did an Ambrosian number on Cicero's dialogue on friendship, the De Amicitia. Aelred's book was called On Spiritual Friendship. It is, in my opinion, a more brilliant book than its model, Ambrose's De Officiis, because he had a better subject. His topic allowed him to deal explicitly with the novelty of Christian love. But if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. For the present, I must insist that I have now done my duty. It's up to you to do yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming, for your lecture. So now it's time for student questions. So you may begin lining up on this side of the aisle, and then you can come and ask your question here.
Dr. Fleming, thanks for coming tonight. You said that duty was more or less adopted as a Christian virtue. Do you think that that was a legitimate adoption? And if so, does it have a role in Christian life today? Or might it have a role in Christian life today?
I'm not absolutely sure that I got that, but you were saying essentially is duty a Christian virtue? Well, I just said it wasn't. You know, you have to do something to kind of make a lecture on duty bearable. It's certainly I would say it has been the essential Christian virtue for moralists since the time of Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, and one of the father of modern philosophy in a certain sense, who articulated the moral law that is usually called the categorical imperative, which when you boil it down is the golden rule, which is Jesus's new commandment in a way, and incidentally that is a commandment that he takes from the Hebrew scriptures. It exists in most of the world's great religions. So if you think of duty in its social sense as a relationship with neighbor or the other, I would say that it's an absolutely fundamental Christian concept. We usually talk about duty, I think, in a secular sense, and in particular when one thinks about military duty, things that you have to do that you may not want to do. Those things are duties. Think of the adjective dutiful. It's really a bad one, isn't it? If you describe somebody as dutiful, well, you don't want to marry that person, you know that. You still seem to be looking up for me.
No. I think you answered that.
I've already said more than I know about this.
Dr. Fleming, I'm a senior at this institution. I still feel sophomoric, so forgive me if this question comes out poorly. But shortly, towards the beginning of your talk, you spoke about, you referenced the line from Troilus and Cressida about the poop shoot, and how you were surprised by how your fellow academics don't engage well with the humor here. And that kind of got me thinking, so this is a little bit off the duty topic.
So good so far.
But how do we bring Christian experience. There's that one line from Nietzsche that gets thrown around that a day without dancing isn't worth living or something like that. And I feel like Nietzsche shouldn't be the one saying that. I feel like that's in the Song of Songs in a couple different ways, and that it's our duty, should be our duty and our pleasure to dance through life. So, does that sound like something interesting to talk about for a little bit?
Before I could answer that adequately, I'd have to see a few of your moves. St. Augustine says something great about him. He says something great about everything almost. But he says the truth is the Lord's. Now, what he means by this is nobody owns the truth except God. And so anywhere you find some truth, don't be afraid to use it. And he developed this very interesting justification for the reading of classical literature. And try to put yourself in the shoes of these early Christians. That is, they really knew what classical culture meant. They knew about the gladiatorial combats. They knew that children were taken out on the hillside and exposed to die if the parents weren't comfortable with raising them and so forth and so on. There was a great deal in paganism that they absolutely wanted to get rid of. But they're also, they wanted to venerate Virgil. They wanted to read the poems and so on. So Augustine came up with this brilliant image that he took out of the story of the Exodus. If you remember, when the Hebrew children fled from Pharaoh, they did something very un-Jewish for good little Jewish kids. They stole all of Pharaoh's pots and pans. The word used in the King James Bible was borrowed, I think. They borrowed money the way my kids borrow money. Now, Augustine said this. He said, those gold and silver implements mean this. The gold is the wisdom of the ancients. The silver is the beautiful language in which it is preserved. It is for us to dig for gold, find gold wherever we can in the old culture, and use it. So it's not. I'm going on too long, but it's a. You can read. I'm absolving you of reading Nietzsche. Go ahead. Do it. Is that? Yeah.
Dr. Fleming, thank you so much for your talk. I was interested when you were speaking about Cicero's De Officiis. You described duties or offices as an understanding of the doctrine of the supreme good combined with the regulation of life into moral duty.
Right.
It seems in modern times that there's less of a agreed upon understanding of what doctrines of supreme good can be or if they exist. And if so, in that sort of a culture, how do we continue to pursue moral duty as a goal, or is that even a possible endeavor?
Well, you're pointing to a real problem, which is, and it's a problem that goes into many facets of modern life, that is, there is no longer, and perhaps there never really was, entirely, a cultural consensus about lots of things. There certainly is no longer a moral consensus about things that seem very clear to most people, really, fairly recently. Augustine has another beautiful saying, you've probably heard, love God and do as you please. Love God and do as you please. Now, the unfortunate context of that remark is that he was talking about the extirpation of the Donatists, heretics. Said, can we kill these people? And he didn't really want you to kill them, but love God and do as you please. There is a tension, and there is going to always be this tension between a ideal moral code and its very messy implementation in the world. I think that in a historical perspective, we're doing better in some ways than we used to, and worse in some ways than we did. But if I'm not preaching absolute indifference or relativism, moral relativism here, but one has to have some lodestar or compass by which you're guiding your life, and it's important that you interrogate this frequently and with as much depth and honesty as you can. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, since you admittedly came here, would have preferred to talk about love rather than duty. If you could rephrase duty in terms of love, how would you do that? And I realize that's a very general question, and it might actually have been narrowed by Ray a little bit previous. But could you do that?
Well, yes. It does seem to me, I mean, the phrase, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself," is a very interesting phrase, because I don't think most people understand how they love themselves. Or it's a phrase that invites you to think about, that is the commandment. It's not just go love indiscriminately, but love as you love yourself. This commandment fits in brilliantly with the old Socratic, the basic notion of Socrates, which was know thyself. You probably know that above the cave of the Delphic oracle, this was the motto that was written, know thyself. That is to say that, and Augustine's, I said a minute ago that it took a genius to understand the De Trinitate. I don't claim to understand it all, but I certainly see that what he is basically saying is that if you want to understand the Trinity, you've got to look within yourself. That is to say that you will see that you have I won't go into it all, but you have a Trinitarian construction and so forth. So the categorical imperative of Kant, treat people do not put it in a negative way. Do not do anything to anybody else that you would be unhappy having done to yourself, is to put in secular terms this generalized commandment for love. It's a very easy commandment to utter, and it's almost impossible to obey, but that's the nature of commandments.
So you would say that the platinum rule, rather than the golden rule, which is Kant's interpretation of it, is a more faithful interpretation of Christ's saying, love your neighbor as yourself.
The platinum rule?
Well, do unto
I
others
think
that
mainly
which...
we're down to the kind of Melmac or styrofoam, right?
I mean, the notion that you do unto others that which you would universalize rather than that which you would do unto yourself merely.
I don't know. I can't answer that question.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for being here, first of all.
Well, thank you. You can sit down now. Just kidding.
You're welcome. said something very interesting towards the beginning. Despite the kind of, protestations and the way it may seem about kind of modern moral relativist-esque people, everyone kind of, if you kind of define duty as that which we ought to do, most people have a conception of that, and believe that there are certain things we ought to do, even if it's just be tolerant to other people or such. But what we often find, what everybody kind of struggles with, especially with our kind of modern perspective on historical situations, is we've seen all these examples of people like you were describing in Nazism and during the Civil War doing what they thought was their duty because they thought it was their duty, and getting it, we would say, very, very wrong. And so I was wondering if you could shed any light on, from a Christian perspective, and a perspective of those who, do believe duty is a good virtue, how we navigate those waters so that we do what it is we ought to do, what it is our duty to do, but we don't fall into the trap of, doing something horrible because of duty.
Right. Well, someone who's influenced my thinking on this a good deal is Arthur Kessler, who is was dead now. I think he's one of the true geniuses of the 20th century. He's an absolutely secular figure with no interest in religion at all. He did kind of vaguely try to transcend materialism, but it was all rather vague. But the way, the terms in which he talked all the time was the terms of ends and means in terms of human behavior. And I think it has to be always the case that ends cannot justify means. We love talking about ends because that is the end product, that's the big abstraction. So how are we going to get to it? One of the former presidents of my university was, I think, a really great man named Robert Goheen. He's dead now. He told me one time, I won't go into the embarrassing circumstances of how he came to tell me this, but he said, John, you should try never to be more than 80% right about anything. And an awful lot of what's wrong in the world comes about because we have a lot of people who think they're at least 98% right, and a lot of people who think they are 100% right. It's very difficult to balance. I mean, the hardest of Christian virtues, and I'm very glad I didn't have to talk about this, the hardest of Christian virtues, and the most important one in a way, is genuine humility. And I think that to try to balance humility, which is saying, I doubt if I'm going to be right more than 80% of the time, when you're dealing with categories that you do believe are absolute, becomes extremely difficult. I mean, and you see this in the rigidity, the sterility of certain of our moral debates, abortion, so forth, where we don't even have a vocabulary where we can talk about things like this in a way anymore. So, you may know the great hymn by John Henry Newman, Lead, Kindly Light. Just one step at a time, one day at a time. Try to focus on achievable ends, and then the long range ends sometimes will take care of themselves.
Thank you very much, sir.
I suppose I'll thank you for being here while I try to organize my question.
Why did I come?
Why? No.
Why did you come? I'm just trying to help.
I'll start out with a point, and then I'll move on to the question. Albeit, I don't know how to pronounce words, jokingly said earlier that you wouldn't want to marry somebody that was dutiful. And I just figured that if a person approached marriage with that mindset, they'd likely just end up divorced on either end. Moving on from there, you mentioned that the golden rule is essentially what duty is from the Christian mindset. And so, couldn't duty be the golden rule itself? And rather than it being adopted as a secondary virtue of Christianity, was instead a virtue that was hijacked and improperly understood due to secular influences in society.
I suppose that's a certain way of interpreting it. I think hijack may be too strong a word, but I think that we tend to think of duty in terms of things that are unpleasant, difficult, and that you're under absolute obligation from force majeure, from some physical force to do. So if you're in the army, your superior officer is telling you to do something. That is your duty to do it. Ambrose and people like this find a much more renegade, upbeat, and happy. It's a great pleasure. You know, you hear people saying, "It is now my pleasant duty to hand you this check for $1,000 that you've won a prize." That is the kind of spirit, I think, in which Ambrose wanted you to think about doing your duty, that you get a satisfaction. I've known people like this. Many of them are very humble people, I mean, people in very ordinary stations of life who do a great job of whatever it is they're doing. That's their duty. And they take great pride and satisfaction in it. That seems to me to be the aim, at least, for what Christian duty ought to mean.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question.
I'm too tall. I'm not going to thank you I'm not going to thank you for being here tonight, but I will say that you do look awesome, whereas some modern youth might say fresh to death. So, you look good, that's what I'm saying. Anyway. Well, I hope I can articulate my question for you here.
Come on, just keep going.
Proponents of nationalism, specifically within America, like to often point out, in some anyway, like to point out that our sense of nationalism, especially among youth, because of like great diversity in public schools and just in America in general, is dwindling, and there's much greater dissension now than there has been in the past. And they'll point to things like, oh, we don't pray in schools anymore, or we don't do the Pledge of Allegiance, before sporting events, or stand out by the flagpole outside of our school. And they'll use those as things like, well, we've lost our sense of nationalism or pride, and oftentimes they'll also connotate this sense of nationalism with duty, and so they'll say, oh, we've just lost our sense of duty or obligation to support our country. So my question is, what kind of correlation is there in the sense that I just described among American nationalism? What kind of correlation is there to duty and nationalism within America? And what do you think of in terms of American youth? Well, I'll just let you answer the question.
Well, I'm not going to wade into any of these culture war issues. I'm not a political theorist or a political thinker. I don't have very interesting political ideas. I am worried by what I think, I don't know whether to call it, I won't call it patriotism, but I am very worried by a great decay in civic spirit in our country, or putting it very negatively, there obviously is a growing, I've seen it in my lifetime, what I call a me first attitude. And it is at all levels, and I'm not able to account for it very well, but I can just say the world in which I'm now living is very different from the world I grew up in a very old-fashioned rural childhood in Arkansas. What to do about this? I don't know. There is very little sense of public spirit, of public service. I think that we probably would not get into these constant wars if we had a draft rather than a professional military, because it's very easy now for people, because somebody is actually getting paid to go and fight these wars. I think this is a very bad, it's really a very bad and dangerous development in this country. For all those years I taught at Princeton, I have nothing against Wall Street in and of itself, but I was pretty discouraged that 30%, 40% of Princeton graduates made a beeline from graduation to the financial industry in or around Wall Street. I think it might have been a good idea to spend a year or two teaching for America, doing something of that kind. I'm old. I mean, I'm a really grumpy old geezer. You gotta expect this kind of thing.
So just to follow up, what sorts of things to you, do you agree that
They're
things
getting
like...
the hook, man.
Well, I guess that's it. You have a good night, Dr. Fleming.
I've been told to make this brief, so I'll try to do so, because probably the less I have my mouth open, the better anyways. But my question is this. Do you believe that duty has an effect on the morality of a decision? So, for example, if you have a duty to do something for your country, and that duty requires you to do something that's maybe immoral, and I know you had brought this up and referenced it in Dante's Inferno, that someone who had done something out of duty but was still immoral. Do you think that duty has an impact on the morality of a decision?
Well, I do think there are many poignant examples in history, literature, and probably in life. I've never faced one myself, I'm very happy to say, when there is a explicit contradiction between a fairly clear social duty and your own moral compass. So you see this with conscientious objectors and people like this. I'm very admiring. I mean, I am not a pacifist or a conscientious objector, but I'm very impressed by people who are willing to pay a great price to follow conscience. And so I do think these, you read books in this college, I'm quite impressed. You've probably read Niebuhr. You know about the distinction between moral man and immoral society. One of the great distinctions he makes is you cannot expect the collective to behave with a level of ethical integrity that individual human beings are called upon to act with. And therefore, there are going to be these kinds of conflicts. How are you going to adjudicate it? This is what Lord Jim is about. Either you jump or you don't jump. And a lot of very good people jump. Very good people. You know, does that mean your copybook is plotted for the rest of time? That's what that novel is about.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Dr. Fleming, we talk a lot about how the unexamined life is not worth living. And as a person who cares deeply about living well, I'm very curious about all sorts of knowledge. So I just want to know if you are ever frustrated by the limitedness of our ability to understand the world, or if you're able to be content in that.
I'm very frustrated, as you would say. Look, I'll be very frank with you. By most standards, I'm a very learned person. I've spent my life studying fairly obscure, hard things, difficult things written in difficult languages, and so forth and so on. To arrive, as I did at the age of 60 or so, I'm now closer to 80 than 70. To arrive at the age of 60 and to understand that I didn't know zilch was a pretty discouraging thing, in a way. But it is true. That is to say, that you can't. I mean, as late as the Renaissance, late as the 18th century, there were people, great geniuses, and so on, who could reasonably aspire to more or less encyclopedic knowledge. I mean, somebody like Pico della Mirandola, back in the 15th century, they said he knew everything. And I'm willing to believe that he knew everything. That is to say, he knew all the Western languages, he'd read all the books and so on. That kind of thing is now absolutely impossible. So one of the first things that you do have to learn, and it's a very sad thing to learn, if you are interested in learning, as I know you are, is that there are very definite limitations on this. But that doesn't mean you should stop striving. And just as in every other aspect of your life, you've got to make priorities. And what I try to teach my own children is there are only so many books you can read. I try to make sure that the ones you read, you're going to be happy that you read, and maybe want to go, do a little bit of triage. But still, there's the struggle, the hope, the aspiration. Without that, I think that's what the examined life really means. I don't know that life is not worth living, but it's certainly much less interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming. All right, we will shortly announce the faculty awards, the Interregnum winners, and the House Cup. But before that, I have many people to thank. When playing something like Interregnum, you accrue a great debt of gratitude. So first, I would like to thank the Interregnum liaisons for all of your work as timers, stampers, and helping us run a smooth event. I would also like to thank the production crew for recording everything and live streaming it. Also, I would like to thank our great faculty for all the time they spent in helping make Interregnum a memorable experience. I I would also especially like to thank our debate coach, Burka Wayashi, for everything he did. And I want to ask the Interregnum Committee to please step forward, and Dr. Parks. Yeah, this team made Interregnum possible. They put a lot of work into it. So please be very grateful to them and to all the work that they put into making Interregnum 9 great. So now we will begin to announce the Interregnum winners. All right, so we will give you the top 3 scores first of every competition. The top 3 winners of performing arts are number 3, the House of C.S. Lewis. Second, the House of Truth, and first, the House of Sir Winston Churchill.
Okay, let's try doing the unity clap because we have a limited amount of time and a lot of things to announce. So in case you don't know how it is, after the winner is announced, you just clap together like that. Okay? Thank you. Now I'm going to announce, you already know this, but the winners of the reading test. In 3rd place, we have the House of Clara Barton. 2nd place, we have the House of Queen Elizabeth I. And in 1st place, we have the House of Margaret Thatcher. I will now announce the results of 3-hour art. In 3rd place, we have the House of Bonhoeffer. In 2nd place, we have the House of Sojourner Truth. And in 1st place, we have the House of Margaret Thatcher.
Okay, I'm going to be announcing the winner of creative writing. In 3rd, we have the House of Bonhoeffer. In 2nd, the House of Reagan. And 1st, the House of Tenboom. Okay, and now for random theme. In 3rd, the House of Thatcher. In 2nd, the House of Tenboom. And 1st, the House of Churchill.
Alright, for more information you already know, the winners of the random theme debate competition. 3rd, the House of Thatcher. Oh shoot, we just did that. Just kidding, guys. Alright, Alright, sorry guys. Okay, the Great Speech Competition. In 3rd, the House of Queen Elizabeth. In 2nd, the House of Tenboom. And in 1st, the House of Reagan. And the winners of the Academic Writing Competition. In a tie for 2nd place, we have the Houses of Queen Elizabeth and Churchill. And in 1st place, the House of Barton.
Okay, for prepared lecture.
third place, the House of Bonhoeffer. In second place, the House of SBA. In first place, the House of Churchill. For parliamentary debate, in third place, the House of SBA. And since I just have to announce the first place winner, the House of Churchill.
All right, for the first place, we will briefly suspend the one clap rule. Third place, the House of Barton. Second place, the House of Thatcher. And first place, the House of Sir Winston Churchill. Now we will have the King's Council announce our faculty awards.
So I do want to echo what Jonathan said about thanking our faculty. They do spend countless hours of work, not just teaching classes and preparing, but also sitting in committees, hiring new faculty, and tending to houses. So if you would join me just one more time thanking our faculty. Every year, the King's Council awards 3 faculty, sort of Faculty of the Year awards, and we'll officially award them this distinction at next week's Faculty Appreciation Luncheon. But we'll also announce it here. So there are 3 categories. First, contribution to student life. Second, contribution to the college. And finally, academic excellence. So the faculty this year who's won contribution to student life has made an enormous contribution this year, stepping up to serve as a house advisor and demonstrating excellence in the classroom and caring for the House of Sir Winston Churchill. We do thank Dr. Bradley. Might as well get a photo, right? So the faculty who won this year's contribution to the college has dedicated a lot of her time already serving a house and has made particular effort this year to care for the women of truth. So we award Professor Don Fotopoulos. And last, for academic excellence, someone who's constantly not only produced their own scholarship and published in a variety of places, but also encouraged students to do the same. We award this year's Faculty of the Year for Academic Excellence, Professor Wilkinson. Join me once more to thank these 3 faculty.
personally think that this past Interregnum has been our best yet. But we can't do it without our committee. And so with that in mind, I want to highly encourage any of you who are interested in serving the school in this way, in talking to any of us about if you have any questions about what it's like to serve on the committee, because let me tell you, it's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun. So if you have any questions whatsoever, just talk to us, email us, and then we will be accepting applications to the Interregnum email account, just your resume and cover letter, starting now. Thank you.
So a quick reminder before we announce the final House Cup standings. These pews up here, don't step on them. That's very, very important because I know you all are very excited to pick up a trophy. But please, for the church's sake, and for the sake of us as guests, let's not step on them. Thank you.
So now, with the conclusion of Interregnum, we're at the culmination of a year of fierce competition. It all started last August, when we threw 20 freshmen in each of your houses, forced you to solve cryptic clues, made you run all over the city, doing roadblocks and detours, taking a seemingly endless subway ride to eat hot dogs in Coney Island with the Great Race. And then we barely let you take a breath when we threw you into the drama competition, where each of your houses performed a truly unforgettable interpretation on the theme of duty. Next, who could forget the epic battle between the double overtime battle between Barton and QE1 in the basketball competition. We tested your academic ability through the GPA competition, your ability to research, present in a creative way through the namesake competition, and finally, you've spent the last 3 days in Interregnum, which is the crown jewel of the House Cup. And so now is the time to announce the winners. We had a lot of lead changes throughout the year. So in third place, I wish I had music right now. You know those TV shows? And they wait like 5 seconds? I wish I had that. Next year. In third place with 470 points, the House of C.S. Lewis. In second place, with 477.5 points, the House of Susan B. Anthony. And coming from, I think, maybe fourth place, the winner of this year's House Cup with 500 points, the House of Churchill. Guys, you get both trophies. Come on up.